Well, welcome everybody and good morning. I know it's first thing for all of you West Coasters. I've already had a couple coffees here in Austin, so I got a head start on you, but we are so happy to have everybody here today. This session is really interactive. Don't let that scare you, but we really are kind of diving into a topic that we're all really interested in digging deeper on in our various practice areas. And so, I think bringing this together, thought about, who can help answer these questions, see if there's potential with this group. And then I can see here in the audience, we've got some folks who I think are going to be awesome at helping us to brainstorm further. So I think you all probably know a little bit about what you're walking into from the sign up page, but just to give you kind of a quick overview, we are going to be digging into all things TDM and mobility data today. We're really coming at this from two different angles and seeing how we can bridge that divide. And so this is very much a question in our own projects across the board here. So we are going to cover kind of the TDM practitioner lens. We're going to cover the mobility data lens and think about how mobility data can be better used in TDM applications. And then also just dig into what would need to happen to better unlock mobility data to serve better TDM outcomes. I'm going to introduce our panelists here in a minute and myself, but first I'll just continue to get us oriented. We are going to cover all things, TDM challenges. We're going to be really candid about the types of data we're not getting that we wish we could have access to better conduct our projects. And then I'm really excited to hear particularly from Heidi on how she approaches some of these problem statements from a mobility data standards perspective. So I am Lauren Mattern. I'm the principal of Nelson Nygaard, and I'm the co-lead of our TDM sector. I'm also here in our Austin office, and I'm joined by three panelists who are going to cover the full breadth of this topic. I'm really excited about everybody here. I am going to give a quick orientation in a minute to kind of the state of the TDM field and some data gaps in it at a high level, and then we're going to dive in and get a deep dive from all three of our panelists. I'm going to let them introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their role and what kind of lens they're bringing to the table on this topic today. I'm going to start with Heidi Guenin.
Hi, I'm Heidi Guenin. I'm with MobilityData. We're a Montreal-based nonprofit that works internationally. I'm in Portland, Oregon. And my background is in public health and urban planning. So that's kind of the lens that I bring to this work. And I hope when we get into the section, I'll help all of you who are not technologists, are not technically inclined, are not software developers, to think about data specifications as something that you also can own and love and feel really excited about at 9 a.m. on a Wednesday morning.
Great. I'm excited to overcome my own anxiety about data standards today. All right, and then we have Carmen Chen, my colleague, who we partner a lot on TDM projects internally for developers and employers and at the city policy level.
Morning, everyone. Carmen. I am based out of our SF office. Technically was in LA for the past 5 years. And my background is in transportation planning, particularly in parking and TDM. Within the TDM realm, working closely with employers and developers to comply with local and regional policies. So I'll be speaking kind of from that perspective about how they currently use data and how they can use mobility data standards to provide more informed TDM decisions and investments.
And last but not least, we have Ben Rosenplatt from the city of Seattle, who's bringing municipal lens. And of course, I think everybody on the call probably knows about the sort of depth of and different policy levels at play with Seattle's plans and ordinances.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren, and thanks, Carmen and Heidi. So my name is Ben Rosenblatt. I'm with the Mobility Solutions team with SDOT. Yeah, and I kind of do a lot of what Carmen just described with my day job, which is our building-based TDM program, which is the Transportation Management Programs, TMPs. And I'll talk a little bit about that today. And I'm going to bring a little bit more of a lens today on some of the climate impacts of mode shift in TDM and how we have been trying to use data that we do have and struggling to try to get better data. It's always a search for better data. So I'm really excited to learn from the other panelists today too about ways forward and then to have a breakout discussion about it. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. So also, our audience members, we are going to share a few perspectives of our own and then move into answering some of your questions. So just drop any question that comes to mind in the chat as we go. I'll give all the hard ones to Carmen, Ben, and Heidi. And then we're also going to have some breakout sessions where we dig into some specific applications, but do feel free to share any questions that pop up as we go through our perspectives to start with here. So as I said earlier, we really are connecting the dots between two different worlds today. As a TDM practitioner, I'm constantly frustrated by the role of data in our field. It's a hot topic. It's a huge piece of a lot of our projects, but it's not something that goes particularly well. And of course, there's been some great examples of innovation in the area, but really a lot left to do. And for a field that is trying to achieve results out of a whole orchestra of different activities, movements, and messages, it's really hard to know if something works. We really need better data, and I need better data to convince more people to do things. So there's so many gaps, and I'm excited to explore some of those today. Carmen and Ben in particular are going to dig into some specifics on that. So this is a kind of a creative work session here to think about what could we do to unblock access to better mobility data? What are some of the lessons learned from our sort of peer projects in slightly different specialty areas, especially around micromobility data, and how some data standards are starting to shape up for serving parallel problem statements, and what we're learning and how it could potentially be leveraged for TDM outcomes. The digging into standards and specifications, that's really what Heidi is here to help us with. And I'm really excited to see her take on all of this, to see if she really does think that some of those parallel standards could be used to make TDM more measurable, more effective, and just work better. And we're all interested in outcomes here. So the intent is that this session is helpful for kind of at the policymaker lens and also, into the deep practitioner lens. I think we're going to cover a lot of ground. And so to make this omelet, what we're going to do is cover some status updates about where mobility data is in general. Heidi's going to use a couple of use cases to help us better understand what the heck it means to use and leverage a mobility data standard for different use cases. And then Carmen and Ben are really going to cover some examples, some real pain points in our field around where they really need better data, who needs data, what's actually useful or not. So we're trying to uncover some of the pain points and then see if there's any room to bridge the gap. So that last part is where we're really hoping that you all will help us break. We want to hear your perspectives, and we will have breakout rooms digging into a few different problem statements. So we consider all of you our co-panel members this morning. So if you have any brilliant ideas or disagree with anything along the way, drop it in the chat or save it for the breakout room. And we plan on learning from you all as part of this session. So I'd like to start by getting a better sense of who's in the room and what you're interested in. Carmen is going to lead us through a couple of really brief questions. You're on mute.
Okay.
Right.
Also just wanted to note we'll actually be using Slido for the question and answer portion. So that way people will be able to log on to slido.com using this code, and then you can input questions there. Why is the sky blue? I really want to know that. If you're really interested in us answering that question, you can just provide an upvote. So starting with a poll using Slido, we really want to understand who's in the room. So just general question, what is your association, like what agency or employer are you associated with?
Great, looks like a lot of planners. Ooh, we have a TDM specialist, awesome. Couple. Okay, so far it looks like our audience is kind of approaching this from a planner and TDM lens, like kind of the practitioner lens. So I think, Heidi, we're going to have a lot to learn from you as we bridge the gap. But it sounds like the audience will kind of understand some of the pain points that Carmen, Ben, and I are feeling in our day-to-day practice as TDM practitioners.
Oops. Oh, there we go. Okay. So interesting to know what everyone's backgrounds are. We also wanted to just generally understand where everyone stood with TDM. What is one word that you would associate with TDM? Necessary. I agree.
So necessary. Anything that reduces driving or SOVs, or as I like to say in Texas, SOTs, single occupancy trucks. We're starting from a little further behind. Anything that shifts trips, reduce congestion. Yeah, there's so many definitions depending on the region and the policy goals. Parking is indeed my favorite TDM measure, so thank you for whoever teed us up there. Options, yeah. I'll never argue with people first, love that. Travel behavior, great. Yeah, this definitely mirrors what Carmen and Ben are going to cover, so it's fun. And here's the hard question.
Yeah, so bringing it back to data, we just want to understand currently, where do you think there is a gap with TDM data? Clearly there is one, which is why we're having this workshop. So is it policy, is it enforcement? Do you have some data standard issues, management?
Okay, results starting to pour in. Yeah, we got a lot of problems, Carmen. Across the board here. All right, well, we've got some ground to cover today, y'all. Yeah, it looks like just, you know, the data gap of understanding if we're hitting our policy outcomes, a big one. On the enforcement side, it didn't get any votes, but I would say that I personally experienced that one the most when I'm talking about like ordinance enforcement or developer enforcement, like these decisions about how to hold different people accountable and find out if they're, you know, accomplishing the outcome we want, or at least doing the things we want. Those are definitely sticky policy issues. And then some folks mentioning data standards, data management, ownership, reliability, kind of the full swath of data challenges. Yeah, I'm sure there's going to be a lot in common with the TDM world and just the general mobility world, with the tough nut of how will we actually collect and use this data? If we get it, what do we need to know? That's exactly what we want to dig into. Great. Well, I think now that we have a little bit of a better sense of who's in the room, let's dig in. Now we know who we're talking to, so appreciate that. So I'll kind of tee us up, and then we're going to pass off the baton to our amazing team here. So our favorite acronym of all time, TDM, means a lot of different things to different people. I know sometimes in a conference setting, you hear people refer to it as like our whole field. So just want to clarify for the sake of today, we're really talking about sort of traditional TDM policies, programs, strategies that are, reducing SOV travel. And of course, we're all trying to crack open what this can mean. I think all of us are interested in, does it TDM programs and policies that are actually increasing mobility, increasing options. So lots of evolution in how we're all thinking about TDM, but just wanted to clarify today that we really are digging into the sort of policy realm, the city TDM programs realm, and then of course developers, employers, districts, downtowns. There are a lot of levels at which we're all traditionally operating that have very distinct metrics challenges. So, I think just a quick nod to how TDM is practiced today and how it's going. I think there are a lot of different levels of practice where it's going really well, and those are usually the place-based focus areas. So whether it's a district and trying to achieve a really specific mode split outcome, our cities that have employer TDM policies, major and including kind of TDM approaches for major events, there's a lot of great practices there. Some folks doing it on their own, but usually it's in a region that has some kind of requirement that's spurring this innovation. Residential TDM, there's some great practices doing quite well. And then, I've been really heartened the last couple of years to see a new cohort of TDM policies in cities across the country, often focused on developers. A lot of our classic TDM policies have also included employers, and I think Ben and Carmen will get into that a little bit, but I am seeing a lot of new developer policies take shape, and some big questions there around how to hold developers accountable and what data we need to be rolling up from their participation in the broad world of TDM. And then if we kind of think about some gaps and some other practice areas we'd like to see more of, there are many critiques that we could levy on the TDM world, and I think we all do. As much as everyone on the panel really leads TDM practices and projects and loves it and champions it and knows its full potential, there's absolutely some areas the field could do a little bit. And those are on the next slide, Carmen, if you can just go forward one more. Thank you so much. We know that we're all eager to make sure that our field is focusing on overall mobility and equitable access. A lot of our TDM policies that have been most effective were shaped in response to maybe an air quality crisis or a traffic crisis, and those are all well and good, but they're kind of designed to serve the goals of a pretty elite white collar kind of worker sort of TDM target. And so we're definitely trying to, as a field, participate in broader usefulness and think about mobility for a lot more folks, think about what it actually means to deliver more equitable mobility, and how the TDM practice representatives can do a better job to expand the tent of who TDM can service. This is definitely a topic I think everyone here is passionate about. We know that even before this pandemic, that TDM was pretty much had a big gap with only focusing on commute trips as the default. Lives are a lot more complex than that. There are a lot of, depending on the region, a lot of trips that are worth reconsidering beyond that. I know that's a hot topic here in Austin, and now with the pandemic and our hybrid work from home lifestyles shaping just everything about how we get to and from the office and everywhere, that's only increased the urgency thinking beyond the commute. And then, you know, the TDM world in some ways, you know, has given a great nod to the behavioral sciences world and thinking about when people are open for change. But on the other hand, it's been fairly limited. I don't think we've really leveraged its full potential. It's nice to have a good grounding sort of the academics of when people are open to behavior change, but at the same time, you know, I'm not sure that we're scaling that to a broad audience, removing some friction for how we can apply and send signals for different mobility decisions to really broad audiences in a seamless way. So there's lots of room for improvement in the TDM world, and some of them come with even stickier data and metrics tracking challenges. So just a quick kind of diagram on the next slide for folks who are coming in a little bit cold into the TDM world. This isn't rocket science, but just to kind of talk through how we're often thinking about TDM projects, you know, we're starting by defining the problem. As I said earlier, a lot of times that's shaped by an existing state or regional or citywide policy goal. Like, you know, in San Francisco, their TDM program may be focused on their kind of transit first manifesto and their, you know, VMT reduction goals that come with the state. Here in Austin, the, you know, TDM goals are very much focused on mode split and then traffic impacts. So a lot of times defining the problem is rooted in, you know, the bigger city policy context. But there are so many things that TDM can do. It can be a little bit too broad of a field. So this problem definition stage is always super critical for all of us and just trying to figure out what we're solving for and get some focus. Then we're applying policies and tools naturally. If we're doing our job right, hopefully we spend most of the time doing things. I would say that's another critique of the TDM world, is that we have a lot of kind of preamble, we have a lot of focus on metrics, but we need to make sure that we're really learning what is working and doing more of that. So this next slide shows some kind of common tools and interventions that we focus on. TDM is a complex ecosystem, so sometimes it's really dealing with land use issues. Parking can't be overstated in its importance as a TDM goal. If we don't put that front and center, we're not going to accomplish any of our goals, no matter how much we lean into the other options. And then of course, we're, you know, getting into the fuller mobility network planning arena anytime we talk about TDM. But you know, specific TDM measures that we're commonly leveraging are anything that helps to connect to better transportation options, give better information, and then anything that incentivizes or subsidizes. So, you know, based on TDM research, the most effective measures are going to be those that give a distinct price or behavior signal and really nudge people to do something. And so we need to make sure that we're giving kind of the finances and incentives behind what we want people to do. So those are some of the typical actions that are coming into play. And then we get to the part we're talking about today, testing effectiveness and feeding that back into what we spend our time on. That last part of the process is what I think the field spends a lot of time on, but I'm not sure that it's going as well as it could be, to be blunt. A lot of our projects are really focused on how do we know that our TDM interventions are working? How do we make sure we're, you know, building a dashboard to show outcomes? And that's all really, really important, but it's not more important than doing things. It's not more important than applying specific tools. So I think what we're all trying to do in our own practices in different ways is make sure that we're, as is classic with any kind of metrics and data standard conversation, how are we getting what we need but not too much? How are we getting what's actionable? Who's using it and what are they using it for? So very much at the heart of today and feeding back into our broader practice. there's a great deal of research in the TDM world that we lean on constantly to get a good high level sense of what's working or not. But we need more information, more modern information, more contextual information on outcomes, so that we can slowly move away from sort of national data sets that we don't have full context on. So there is tremendous potential to better use discrete information, discrete data about what's working or not. We're going through, I would say, another TDM renaissance right now, with more cities adopting Seattle and Washington State style TDM ordinances. So we're all taking a page from Ben's book right now. And so it's a great time to make sure that we're asking our participants for the right amount of information, but not too much, hopefully making it a heck of a lot easier for them to share information, and then setting all of us up for success to evolve our practice and keep pushing the right actions at the core of our programs. So I'm going to wrap really quickly with a couple of examples, and then I'm going to pass it off to Heidi. So TDM is happening on a bunch of different levels. We mentioned in Seattle that Ben will cover this, but they've got a really robust TDM program and set of policies that's based on state law. There's also some districts doing specific things. I'm just going to give kind of a loose anecdote here in Austin. Like a lot of places, we have the regional MPO trying to understand TDM at that level, including some pretty different types of places. And there's so much focus on understanding what's going on with trips and travel at the regional level. And then if you bump down to the city lens, they have really, really important and aggressive mode split goals, which they are taking really seriously and pushing into all TDM programs. So figuring out how we're doing, and if all of the activities that different city departments are aggressively seeking to get there are working, is very much top of mind. And that spans different policy types. For our developer ordinance, that's coming out this summer, or the city's developer ordinance rather, they are going to be requiring a lot of new built projects to participate. And with such a huge new influx of folks, contributing to the TDM landscape locally, this question of what's working and how they want to tweak their ordinance and toolkit over time is very, very much top of mind here. They may want to tweak their requirements. They may find that they need to go more aggressive on on their parking maximums or something like that. And they are ready to use that data, but it requires asks from different people, and they get, there's pushback with every ask. So I think nobody's interested in creating extra friction. We all want to spend our limited time and dollars on what is going to drive behavior change, but we also want some information to know if we're doing the right things, because these are big investments that we're asking a whole new swath of people to make. Meanwhile, on the program side, there are city operated TDM programs and TMO operated TDM programs, and people want to know if what they're doing is working. That's often at the district level or a sample level of some kind. And those programs have all traditionally relied on surveys. Surveys they're okay. We're pretty good at them. Carmen's good at them. I've seen her make them less annoying on my project. But at the same time, the sample sizes, depending on the participant, is really low. It's not great data. We don't know if it's the right, sort of level of accuracy and sample size to drive really important and expensive decisions. So there's tons of interest in finding, data sources and new standards, new tools that can get that information with removing friction and get more accurate report outs on how we're doing, and see if all of these different activities that we're spending a lot of time designing and implementing are working. So that's where we're at as a field. when I compare it to some of our peers, some of you emerging mobility folks on the line, I get really jealous that you all are tackling better data standards. I know that in the micromobility market that some of the data collected to kind of enforce standards has also had some different side benefits in seeing how things are working and guiding policymaking. So I'm excited to think about if there are other methods from our peers that we can take a cue from in measuring TDM policy effectiveness for us. We know that, cities, including the city of Austin, have a mountain of new mobility data from different providers. They're making good use of that for these specific programs, but as they get more of it, we're super curious if we can use any of that to support TDM programming. So these are the types of questions I want to hear everyone's opinion on as we proceed. So the crux of what we want to get into today is to connect all of these gaps to see what's possible and get all of your opinions and the panelists' opinions. I think there is a big unmet need here, a big opportunity. And so we're not sure where the conversation is going to go today, but I'm so excited to find out. As we think about these missed connections and really celebrating the good policy work going on, but bringing maybe some better data practices to it, we want to see how we can connect mobility standards and TDM outcomes and practices and see if there's some real world next steps to come at the end of this. And that involves all of you. We think that you all are a huge part of the answer. To be blunt, there's no solution already on the books. I think we're all coming at this from different ways, critiquing it in our own practice areas and doing better, but these are disparate efforts. There's no coordinated scheme right now to really move this forward. And I'm curious if folks participating today think that there should be. There's a lot of need for collaboration with TDM practitioners, our mobility providers, our data community. There's a lot of great TDM researchers out there, and then a whole bunch of end users on the policy level, and then implementers and people who are forced to be implementers, like developers and employers. So today, I'm really hoping that we can cover a shared understanding of the problem, what the unmet needs are, and then crowdsource ideas. So with that, Carmen is going to turn it over to Heidi, who is going to help us understand the mobility data landscape, and then we'll dive into more TDM problem statements and see if there's any synergies there.
Carmen, you want me to just start sharing my screen directly? Okay. Okay. Great. Thanks for joining us this morning. And I have a note to myself to slow down. I made cold brew coffee that I let sit for way too long. And so if one of the other presenters just wave at me if I'm speaking too fast, and then that'll help me slow myself down a little bit. This is an occasional problem. So I'm Heidi Guenin. I'm the director of product for shared mobility at MobilityData. And just want to kind of take a moment to tell you why you should listen to me talk to you about this at all, like why that matters. So MobilityData is a nonprofit organization. We're based in Canada. We work internationally. And my role there is really focused on the shared mobility specifications that we govern, but we govern several other specifications, and I'll talk about them throughout this presentation. And at MobilityData, our mission is to enable interoperability in transportation systems. And we do that by identifying the interests that are shared by our different stakeholders. And so when I talk about stakeholders, I'm talking about the folks who create the data, the folks who use the data, and then even kind of ultimately down the line, the traveling public who maybe are benefiting from all the stuff that we're talking about, but on my side, I'm not working with as directly. And so we do that, we create these data formats, we govern them, we maintain them, we create infrastructure around them, and then support that standardization and that adoption. And I'll kind of talk about what all of these words mean, because they probably have a specific meaning in the English language, but they have a different meaning for all of us as we think about them as well. So this is kind of how I'm going to walk through my little bit here. We're going to talk about specification versus standard. I'm going to talk about what we even mean when we say open. Again, the word open has an awful lot of ways we can think about it. I'm going to talk about some of the more common data standards that would be really applicable to the TDM community, and then their use. And then we can start to talk about those gaps for practitioners, although that'll be a much bigger part of our later conversation. So first, when I think about a specification is like a dictionary. It provides definitions for important concepts. It's kind of like a way to describe something. It is a language, but an important thing about a specification is that it's not necessarily a shared language. So a standard is a shared language, right? So this is many different people understand, and they rely on the exact same dictionary to reflect what's in the language. So a specification allows someone to describe something in a really systematic way, but it doesn't have to be shared between individuals or organizations to be a specification. It is that sharing that really kind of turns it into a standard. So I want to start with, like, how do we even get a specification started? And we've all been in a lot of Zoom calls. All of my presentations typically are full of shared scooters and shared cars and shared bikes, and I'm tired of seeing them. So I'm trying something new, and I hope it works for everybody. It kind of brought me a little bit back to, you know, the 2000s presentations. So how do we start a specification? We're going to start with this guy, Melvin. So Melvin is interested in describing his dinner in a really kind of systematic way. He has decided that these are the most important things to him. What's the main ingredient? What's the temperature? How crunchy is it? What's the saltiness like? And how much of it is he getting, right? And he can use this way of describing it over and over again, right? He can apply this same sort of way of describing his dinner every single night. And so we'll call this the cat food pleasure index, because we like acronyms, right? Of course we do. So, and I just want to note, you can see at the bottom this little bit of like code looking stuff. This is how the cat food pleasure index would be represented in the bike share feed specification. And I think almost all of us are very used to seeing stuff written as it is above in that little matrix. I want you to see what it looks like in JSON and see how not scary it is, because that's what it looks like. That's what it looks like for the developers. So I just want all of us to kind of see where this is like something that's pretty accessible. So this works for Melvin. He can kind of think about this every day. This is exactly how his dinner kind of stacks up. But what if he wants to compare his CFPI to his sister's to make sure that he's not getting cheated, that she's not getting a better CFPI than he's getting every night, right? So now the specification, he's got to start to think about it a little more broadly. So the first thing we have to note is that if he's going to start sharing this with someone else, he needs to be really clear about what his definitions are, right? So when the main ingredient is rabbit, what does that mean? When he was just thinking about it for his own use, he could keep those answers in his head. It wasn't that important to make incredibly clear what rabbit meant. But now, if he wants to have this used by anyone else, he's got to be a lot clearer about it. So he decides he's going to go with it by weight, the most important ingredient by weight, the highest presence by weight. We're not getting into how he gets to write this, if there are two different main ingredients. This is all important stuff that like specifications eventually have to deal with the more they move around. Looks like he's using degrees Fahrenheit for temperature. This is great. So he's going with an already existing standard. Fantastic. No need to recreate that one. For crunchiness, again, he didn't want to reinvent the wheel. Did a little internet research and found this fantastic scale that looks at the acoustics and the multi-dimensional scaling of different kinds of wet food, and decided to take that scale. I couldn't miss an opportunity to use a different kind of MDS here. And so that's what he went for crunchiness, just adopted an existing standard, popped it into his own standard. For saltiness, he had like done a lot of research on the crunchiness side. And so for saltiness, he was like, is it good or is it bad? It's good if it's right, it's bad if it's not right, and decided to stick with this. recognizing it might not be the best answer long-term, but he wanted more input from other people. And then for quantity, went with grams, easy enough. So now it's time to see if this specification will work for his sister, Finn here. Finn's a little grumpier, she's a little more detail-oriented, and she's a much pickier eater, right? So she's not convinced that the way Melvin wants to represent things is actually going to represent her interests as well. She likes the look of it overall, but she wants more specificity in that saltiness thing. And he knew that was going to be an issue, so he accepts her suggestion, and they just start by measuring the milligrams of sodium. So you can see down here, we have saltiness is good. We're going to switch that over to milligrams of sodium. And then that way, each cat can make the call about whether the food has enough salt based on standard information that they can compare to their own individual needs. So the specification isn't saying whether something's good or bad, it's just saying what it is. And maybe they can build a software application on top of it where you can put in your own preferences and it'll pop out which food is good and which food is bad. So now the two of them are using it to describe dinner. And that's just sort of like twins having their own secret language. This is not a standard yet. In order to get it to be a standard, they start talking with friends and colleagues, and they convince 30 of the other neighborhood cats that the CFPI is absolutely the way to measure wet cat food dinner. So all of the cats, they're ready to get the data in the same format. They want to compare their dinner across different days and households and seasons. A few of the cats really want some information about the dry cat food too, but they've agreed to wait and kind of see how this first round of data goes and then make tweaks as they go so that they can just kind of learn from the process. But our cat data consumers have missed this really important component while they were developing their specification, which is, and trying to make it into a standard, which is that they're not the ones who are going to produce this data. And they haven't talked to any of the data producers, the humans who are like the suckers who do their bidding generally, who are going to provide the data to see if this is going to work, right? So now they got to start doing that. They start negotiating with the humans, the data producers about the CFPI, and the negotiations give both of the parties a lot of insight into what's important for each of them, right? In terms of the ease of producing the data, the ease of understanding and consuming it, what's really important, what we might be able to do longer term but doesn't work for right now. The CFPI is a pretty lightweight standard. So even though the data producer humans aren't like really excited about weighing and temping dinner every single night, they're pretty stoked that the main ingredient and the saltiness data is just easily gathered from the package of the cat food. So that's not so bad. Okay, willing to accept that. But the crunchiness thing, in order to get the crunchiness data, the data producers would have to eat the cat food, right? And the data producers are not interested in eating the cat food. This does not feel like a feasible solution to the data producers. So there's a conversation. Is there a proxy that could work for this? Like, can we find something else that gets you the kind of information you were looking for? So the humans suggest, okay, maybe we can start with a list of the different types of wet food. It provides information about the texture. It's pretty easily available. I don't have to eat the cat food in order to provide that information, right? So we decide to start with a list of possible solutions. Choose from pate, chunky, that rehydrated, freeze-dried stuff, and raw. And we'll start from there, and we'll see if this kind of gets us what we want. So now we agree on that. Turns out that developing a specification, even one this simple, is kind of a lot of work and a lot of stakeholder work. And turning that specification into a standard is like a totally different kind of work. So I want to do a little summary here, what happened. This example touched on kind of the essence of a specification and a standard, and I hope kind of helps us understand the difference between the specification and what it means to be a standard. And then some other topics that came up included some of the intended uses of the data for the cats and the initial process for generating the specification. But we didn't talk about who's going to have access to the data produced eventually. We didn't talk about all the rules and regulations about how you access that data, how you use it, how you can reproduce it, how you can sell it or not sell it. We didn't talk about how the changes to the specification would be decided in the future. So we already know that there's other cats who really want to see this represent dry cat food data. And what if in practice we find that many cat foods have two main ingredients that have the exact same weight? How are we going to handle that? So who is going to make those decisions and how are they going to be adopted into the specification and the standard? We didn't talk about the reasons why the data producers would even agree to this work, right? Like Does this mean you're going to stop knocking over my bouquets? Like, what do I get out of this? Why am I going to agree to do all of this extra work to make this data for you? We talk a lot about carrots and sticks in TDM as well. And this is also critically important in data production, right? Why? Why would you do this? Why would you produce this data for me in the format that I'm asking for? So these are some of the many kind of thorny issues that are related to data specifications and the standards. And we'll kind of keep touching on them briefly, throughout the rest of the workshop. Okay, so next topic. What do we mean by open? Some of the issues that I just brought up, we can address here under this one topic, right? Of what does open mean? And we'll get into that a little bit here. So we've got another Slido. What does open mean to you? Are you seeing this guy now? My fellow presenters?
No, it just shows the presenter view of it. So not like the QR code or the key code to enter.
Fantastic. It says start presenting to display the poll results. But I am presenting.
Well, let's just use the chat in
That's a perfect idea.
in Zoom, because I definitely want to hear what people's answer is.
Got nothing, huh?
No, but we are getting some good answers in the chat just directly on Zoom. So at least we'll get a flavor.
Okay.
And can you see those, Heidi, or do you want me to read them aloud?
I can't, no.
Okay, I got you covered. Okay, so we're getting answers along the lines of anyone can access it, it's aggregated, so anyone can use it. Yeah, anyone can access and reuse, easily accessible. The public can view it in a way that is easy to digest. It's free to access, publicly open, free to access, and machine readable files.
Sweet, okay. Ooh, that's all fun stuff. Great, thank you. We'll talk about all that. So yeah, so those are exactly some of the ideas that we think about when we think about open access. So we have one way of thinking about it is whether or not a specification is open is whether or not you can access it without paying for the privilege, right? So here's a couple examples. I'm sure everybody's probably familiar with SAE as a standards body, or maybe you haven't had the pleasure. But SAE produces thousands and thousands of different kinds of standards. And but as you can see here, you got to contact their sales team if you want to see them. So it's a closed standard. It's still standard. It's used across lots of different industries, but you have to pay to access it. Over here, we've got the general transit feed specification has an extension coming up. It's available on Google Docs for anyone to read and comment on and propose things to, and it's available on GitHub for free. The license is such that you can freely access it, freely use it, change it, kind of do whatever you want. So that's, there are different ways of doing that. And then we can also say, when we talk about free to access, it's going to look different for different folks, right? So this idea that it's publicly accessible, yes, GitHub is publicly accessible. How much anybody in the public likes to hang out on GitHub is a different question, right? So, I mean, I think we have like that question about accessible really makes a difference here. So the ones that we just looked at, these are standards. SAE is a standard body, GTF is a standard. This is also true of the data that gets created through these standards, right? So here we have two examples of transit land. So this is a website that aggregates all the different feeds for transit, for GTFS that's available. And it just puts all of the endpoints in one place and you can find them and click on them and it's easy to find. We've seen something similar for bike share on the bike share map, where you can just see all of the different things that exist and you can just access that by opening the website. Over here we have an organization called Ito World, and you can see get our brochure. You know, generally when you see stuff like that, that's a sales team. They're doing stuff to the data that, you know, adds value, and then they're charging you for that, right? Sometimes even with data that may have been originally freely accessible, but if that data needs more transformation, then it may not be free to access. And there's also a question about whether free to access, what that line is, right? So we know that free just means free, but is a reasonable fee acceptable? What's a reasonable fee? Who decides that, right? All of this work is work. There are people who had to do it. And so where do we think about who pays for that? This is a common pool resource. Nobody wants to pay for it. So how do we think about that? We also have the idea of how it's governed. So this isn't something that came up in the chat box, but it's something that we think about a lot, which is how open is your governance process and who can participate. So there's the openness in terms of transparency, and then there's the openness in terms of participation. So we have a few quick examples here. So the standards that we govern, everyone who creates the data or consumes the data is a stakeholder. They can participate, they can vote, they can work in the change process. It's clearly outlined here. And when you vote, you have to tell us who you are. So, so if you decide that you're trying to add something to the specification, everybody gets to see who's trying to add it and what that looks like. One of the examples we'll talk about later is a European one, and that one has a very different process that requires voting by the national governments. So still very transparent. Who gets to get involved? Not me. You know, you're going to be looking at your elected officials to be working on that for you. The Open Mobility Foundation has their governance process laid out in their GitHub, right? And this is probably one that you're familiar with, MDS. We talked about the scooter data, and the approval of changes happens by the OMF board. So transparent in terms of, yep, everybody can see what's happening, everyone can participate on the GitHub, but then the decisions ultimately get made by the board. So there's several different kind of ways of what open means in terms of this governance piece. So I'm going to walk through really quickly some of these common data standards and their use so that we are set up for talking about the gaps. So the first thing, well, let's go back to this for a second. So some of those questions that we had not covered in the cat food pleasure index, we're going to get to them here, right? So in the open section, we talked about who would have access and how they could use the data, how the change process is governed, but we didn't tackle why people might do this to begin with. Like, why would you use data standards? Why would you use open data? Why would anyone produce this data? So I want to talk about some of the jobs that data standards can do, right? And these jobs vary wildly. So maybe it depends on your audience. Is it for travelers? Is it for regulators? Is it for somebody managing operations? Is it something that you need real time or that you want archival data? Do you want it to be queryable, or is it okay to just have a snapshot? Are you trying to plan a trip, or are you trying to decide if you can find a scooter company? Or are you trying to develop your parking pricing policies and figure out if a third party is the right group to get into a contract with? How much revenue are you going to give them, right? There's like a ton of ways that data standards can help do all these different jobs. And so I'll talk about the ones that I think are most relevant to TDM, but it's really important to think about, like, there's not like a data standard to rule all data standards, and anything that pretends it is or claims it is not trustworthy for all kinds of reasons. And we can talk about that. So why do you want an open data standard? So for me, these are kind of the critically important parts, particularly for TDM practitioners, for cities, for researchers. There's a lot of development tools out there already. These things already exist. When it's a standard and when it's open, you have access to a lot more that you don't have to build from scratch. There's a community around the specification who is there to help you, to answer questions, to really support all of the different use cases, to tell you, yeah, you can use it that way, yeah, you can't. It evolves over time, and that depends on the changing needs. And so that's partly the governance process, and then partly kind of who the audience is. It can be really easily consumed and reused by a lot of people within that standard ecosystem, which allows for evaluation across all kinds of different factors. And these solutions have already been tested and approved, right, by a lot of different stakeholders. They've used it over and over again. And organizations like mine or like the OMF kind of help centralize those needs and kind of create that discussion. You get this information without confidentiality issues. So somebody mentioned the open meaning aggregated, meaning publicly accessible. So the hope is that by a standards body having made this decision with a community, some decisions have been made around how safe that information is to share. If it is decided it is not shared, that there's a process for fixing that, right? This is all kind of part of what exists in the standard. Just putting the data out there allows application developers to create all kinds of solutions that may not be financially feasible for a big firm or for a city, but that somebody can put together. In Portland, we have probably 30 different Where's My Bus kind of applications, and everyone I know has one or two favorites, right? And these just came because we have really great open data. Cities get to focus on producing that data and producing the services, and not the app development and the maintenance. They can kind of just make sure that their data is good enough that the app developers can create all kinds of new solutions. But cities can still control that information by requiring it to be produced in a certain way and in an open way. So, okay, let's get into just a few of the standards. I'm going to focus on the ones that I'm a lot more familiar with, and I'll talk about the other ones. But the ones I'm a lot more familiar with are also the ones that produce open data. They're intended to produce open data. So I think they're particularly useful to TDM practitioners. GTFS, this is transit. If you go on to Google Maps, Apple Maps, Transit app, Move It, City Planner, any of those, and you're trying to plan a trip from A to B, this is what you're going to get. You're going to get your information in GTFS format. So it was drafted in 2005. This is like a granddaddy of the specification world. The governance process was put in 2008, got renamed. Real-time data was created a year later. Most people have a smartphone, so now like all this kind of passenger data is starting to feed back in. And then we were created in 2019 to continue governing and improving this. This is used across North America. It's used across Europe and in Australia as well. And then in the rest of the world to other extents. This is basically for a rider, right? This is where this information is. There are extensions to GTFS that have been proposed that might be valuable to TDM professionals. There's an extension called GTFS Rides that ODOT has proposed. Nobody has been interested in producing or consuming the data. Nobody has been explicit about that. And so that's what they need. They need that to happen in order for this to become part of the specification. So this is a place where TDM professionals can absolutely get engaged with that project and say, we want this data. This is what we want it to look like. This is how we'd use it. The general bike share fee specification is the one that I help govern. This started out as bikes, right? But of course, as we went through, oh, Mitch Vars, I wanted to note, I loved seeing that Nice Ride slide. Mitch operated Nice Ride for a long time, and he wrote the bike share feed specification originally. And so then it was used by Motivate and other folks. And then eventually, of course, the scooters and dockless bike share and electric bikes and all these things showed up. So the spec has been evolving constantly, right? And this is another one where we're governing this one. And so you can see this like constant evolution. This is designed for trip planning as well. So this is the kind of information that helps travelers find things. But one of the things that we have heard is that it has a lot of regulation value, a lot of research value. Some of that research value is in information that is a little too sensitive to be published publicly. So we have a working group right now called GBFS Private, where we are working on adding fields to GBFS that would not be publicly accessible. They would be exchanged privately behind authentication. And one of the big asks we've gotten from our European stakeholders, is including environmental information about the trips and about the vehicles. And so this is something that TDM practitioners may be very interested in getting engaged in too. So these standards are living, breathing things. Just because it is what it is, people find other uses for it. And then sometimes the tool evolves to meet those new uses, or sometimes we decide we need a new tool. And either of those things are possible, but the regulating groups for these standards need to know what your needs are before we can even do it. We're creating a general on-demand feed specification. This is a new one. There's a work group for it right now. And this is related to microtransit and ride hailing and taxis. Curb LR is an open standard related to curb inventories. So this was created by Shared Streets. MobilityData is going to be taking over the governance of this in the next couple months as well. And so this is really just a great inventory, right? Like this is for cities to see, what do you have? This is not the thing that tells you, oh, this parking space is not open right now. It just tells you what parking spaces you have in general. So a lot of these standards, the APIs get built on top of them. The other software gets built on top of them. But for TDM, you've got the data at least, right? And then what you do with the data after that is kind of, that's not our realm so much. This one, so I had that slide. So it's really just kind of storing the information, and other folks build the applications on top. MDS we've talked about. This is where a lot of that scooter data is coming from. This was created really for the regulation and compliance kind of perspective for cities. And there are 3 main APIs. The provider one is the one that's most commonly used. That's provider sending information to cities. And I'm going to scream through these next ones here. NetText and Siri, these are European ones. These are comprehensive, so comprehensive. They cover everything that you could possibly cover. They're hundreds of pages. They are not easily digestible by researchers or planning organizations, but they provide kind of the regulatory framework for European countries to say, we've met our EU regulations. And so that's why they are just wildly out there. We have conversion tools that take the data that is really critical for trip planners and kicks it out to trip planners. So this is another thing, even where there's a standard that might not work for what you want or might ask for too much information, we can convert between them. Okay, so I had another Slido here, but that doesn't work apparently. And it was my last one, so we can just talk about it instead during our breakout. Does that work?
Awesome, thanks, Heidi. Yeah, and we can do the chat version too if you'd like. Either way, there's a couple. We were planning on kind of holding on Q&A, but there are a couple of questions that are really specific to what you talked through. So I'm just going to hit you with a couple quick questions, and then we'll move on to Carmen. So Hayes was asking, who pays for the development and support of a data standard?
That's a fantastic question. So the answer is, it depends. Sometimes when these are top down, so they're coming from maybe a national government or the EU, they may provide some funding for the individual nation states or for consultants to start to develop the specification. In our case, we have a combination of members who are gloriously generous organizations who recognize that they have a common access resource that they benefit from, and they agree to pay a small membership fee to help support us. We do some specific scopes of work when people want extensions done more quickly than we may otherwise be able to do. And a lot of it is it's kind of patchwork. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's important to all of us to make sure we're aligning as closely as we can with other governance models and other organizations, so that we also leverage all of those efficiencies between ourselves and among our different organizations, because it's a time-consuming, resource-consuming thing that's hard to pay for.
Super interesting. I'm curious to see what others think. I'm just picturing who that would be in our world. ACT or NACTO probably are the two folks, but I'm curious, Ben and Carmen, if you can think of any other kind of natural champions at that scale who would be the right partner for this type of conversation.
Yeah, I would think both of those groups would probably be the ones I'd lean to. ACT for its kind of connection to the developer community, NACTO because they're NACTO, and I think some of the things I'll talk about in a little while in terms of climate and just what mode split kind of relates to in our city goals and goals overall. I think either of those groups would probably be wise.
Yeah.
And I'll third vote ACT too, just because I'm part of it, but also, like Ben said, it captures the developer perspective as well as a lot of major employers too, who are a part of the organization.
And NACTO did help fund the initial development of Curb LR. And so that they were kind of an incubator for that. And part of the discussion about the transition over to us is that, well, now it needs someone to maintain it and govern it and continue that process. And I think that's an important thing about data standards that is tough for folks to wrap their minds around, maybe who don't deal with it regularly, is it's like anything else. I mean, it needs a lot of upkeep, and there's a lot of tools built around it and resources and things like that. And yeah, lots of partners involved in that side.
And then Heidi, I think this came through in your tour of different standards, but just to put a finer point on it, what data standards exist that are the kind of the most focused on general mobility, or the kind of the most general? And then are there any inherent challenges in thinking about slightly broader scoped, slightly more general mobility data feeds?
So, I mean, I will say that most of the standards are by mode, right? Even when they overlap and they borrow things. So MDS borrowed from GBFS, GBFS borrowed from GTFS. This is kind of the way they work. We do tend to use them all together. I think those are among the broadest ones that you can have access to. One of the things I'll say for TDM is that we had heard with GBFS, we used to have a stable vehicle ID and we removed it because it caused traveler privacy issues. We heard from researchers that was a big problem for them because they were really using it in a lot of different ways, and they can't get access to MDS data in the same way for the decisions, the agreements between cities and operators and things like that. We had some researchers recently publish a paper about how to de-anonymize the vehicle ID so that they could get back to the information we were trying to keep them from having. So we've been talking with OMF about potentially pulling together even just an initial just kind of meeting around evaluator and research folks and what GBFS private or MDS might be able to help them with. So I think these conversations are really, I mean, I think to your slide that was like, we don't have the answers. We are really just starting out. And I think that question of how much data do you need to evaluate, that combination of the existing standards plus surveys might be the best combo you get of as broad as possible with like the specific information that you need sometimes.
Fantastic. Well, I can't wait to continue that conversation in the breakout later and think about like, which modes are covered, which aren't. How does that map with what TDM practitioners like Matt and Carmen are trying to match to the questions that they need to answer about effectiveness? So that'll be a good conversation to continue. Great. So we are going to flip to Carmen Chen right now. Carmen is going to build on kind of where we started. And she's going to talk about how employers and developers are or are not really engaging with data as they work with TDM tools. And I have to say, Heidi, I feel a lot less scared of mobility data specifications after your presentation. So mission accomplished. Thank you. And Carmen, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. So now that Heidi gave us a good understanding of what mobility data standards are and what it can do, I'm just going to talk about how this can be useful from the developer and employer perspective, while still keeping in the back of our minds about how this can lead to applying data standards to some major TDM decisions. So to start off, I'll give a brief background about what the current state of TDM is, particularly looking at what type of policies trigger any type of TDM requirements for developer employers. And within that, what's the data that is being collected? How is it being used in order to comply with those policies? What are the gaps? And lastly, what is the potential with better data? So starting off with the current state of TDM. So the reason why we're looking at major developers and employers are because they are major generators and can serve as good partners to cities in regards to mobility data. So to better understand how that's possible, I'm going to dive into some local and regional policies that are developer and employer-based TDM. So for developer-based, say you are a developer and you see this plot of land and you want to build a cat hotel. Let's stick with cats. So what you will need to do is first work with the city with where the development is. So based on a certain land use size, the size of the development, the number of trips, and even geography, it can kind of trigger whether or not you need to do a TDM plan. So on the more robust end of the spectrum, if you were developing the cat hotel in San Francisco, for example, they have a TDM program standards. And what that means is if you fall within any of these land use categories, you have to hit a certain target, and it's a points-based type of system relating to how many trips you are bringing to the development and how you can minimize those trips through some TDM investments. So not really sure where a cat hotel would fall, maybe under other. So let's stick with that. So as a developer, in order to meet those 3 points that you will need, San Francisco has a matrix of all the different types of TDM options that are available, what land use categories are eligible for those measures, as well as a point relationship to how much VMT reduction each measure can provide. So aside from the more robust TDM programs, in other cases, TDM may not be as explicit. So say, for example, you want to build a mixed use development in Rancho Cucamonga. So per city code, you are required to say provide at least 100 parking spaces based on your proposed land use. However, you also want to provide a suite of TDM benefits. You might want to provide car share, a car share program like Zipcar or something, transit passes, etc. But in order to do so, you'll need to hire a third-party consultant to conduct an analysis to project what the estimated parking demand is to justify a reduced supply. So that's kind of one, I guess, more lighter touch of how TDM can be brought in through policies. And on the employer side, TDM is mainly triggered through employer-based trip reduction ordinances and regulations. So this is mainly based on employer size. So you're an existing employer, say you're a grocery store and you have a bunch of employees. So in Southern California, you have to abide by the Air Quality Management District Rule 2202 guidance, which basically specifies if you have more than 250 employees, you have to hit a certain average vehicle ridership target. So what that basically means is based on wherever you're located, say you're located in LA, the average vehicle ridership target might be 1.75. So on average, how many people are in one vehicle? And how you are able to prove that is by conducting an annual survey in order to prove whether you can or cannot meet that target. If you cannot, then that triggers the need to develop a TDM plan. Now, let's say you're trying to develop something, or you're an employer in Maricopa County. The regulations here are slightly different. So with their travel reduction program, you similarly do have to conduct an annual survey, but what is being measured is an average vehicle ridership. Instead, it's looking at mode split, so really trying to hit a 60% single occupancy vehicle target. And while you may not be able to hit that right off the bat, you need to show a demonstrated commitment through your TDM program to hit that target incrementally throughout the course of 5 or more plus years. So now that we have a kind of understanding of how developer employers may have to address TDM, I want to touch a bit on how data is used to comply with these type of policies. So TDM is really about achieving some kind of behavior change. We're really trying to reduce vehicle trips, and how we measure that data is key in understanding how we can measure the effectiveness of TDM. And while we all do want data, there is a clear gap. So I'll touch a little bit on that. Data is used now primarily to comply with these policies. So first with parking demand and trip reduction, and then also in order to comply with the policies, a lot of them have like an annual monitoring and reporting requirement. So within parking demand and trip reduction, our work really relies heavily on research such as the one on the screen by CAPCOA, California Air Pollution Control Officers Association. So what that does is basically list a bunch of different TDM measures and associated effectiveness percent reduction for each of those measures. Now, the issue with using sources like this is that a lot of this is really outdated. It's dated back to 2010, and it still remains one of the most comprehensive resources. Secondly, it's not very site specific. So while some measures are kind of scaled by the general type of city you're in, it's not really tailored to the specific land uses. And lastly, there's really limited case studies available within these realms. Developers have to comply with all these requirements, but at the same time, none of this information is being shared. So given the lack of use cases and case studies, it really doesn't provide us a good snapshot as to how effective all these measures truly are. So on to monitoring and reporting. One of the methods that are currently being used, and maybe not as common, is using like a parking utilization study or even trip counts at certain entry and exit points. So what that brings us challenge-wise is that it really only focuses on vehicle trips. It doesn't capture mode split of other modes. And it doesn't give a good understanding of the overall travel pattern. So instead, what is mainly being used in practice are these annual commute surveys. However, one of the main difficulties that we hear from employers and developers is that it's really difficult to reach that required response rate. Everybody's required to provide at least 60% of a response rate. So there's some difficulty in that. And in addition to that, it's a really inaccurate representation of the population because not everyone fills it out. And even if you do fill it out and you're not able to meet your 60% reduction or 60% response rate, the remainder gets counted as a single occupancy trip. So it's really not capturing everything that is actually like a non-SOV trip. Other concerns are privacy. So a lot of these surveys don't necessarily ask for origin and destination, which is key in making informed TDM decisions to be able to address the population that you're serving. So while surveys like this, like Maricopa County's does capture like cross streets for home, it doesn't really match it that well in the larger aspect. And lastly, the challenge I'll talk about is there's a disconnect with TDM programming. So these surveys are capturing how people are traveling, but it's really not capturing how, like what type of TDM programs employers are providing. So you have understanding of how people, like the percentage of people who are driving, but what is that really being attributed to? And given that lack of data and connection, cities aren't able to update their policies to really accurately represent the effectiveness of different TDM measures. So what's the potential? Well, in addressing these gaps, we want to touch on what employers and developers can do with better data. So first, with parking demand and trip reduction, being able to capture that data, whether it be through like a parking, like real-time parking information or trip reduction, being able to understand what different modes are generating to a certain development will be really useful in meeting the TDM policy compliances. And lastly, in addition to for employers and developers being able to comply with TDM policies, they'll also be able to make much more informed TDM investments with better data. So this will be able to help them better understand how people travel, make informed investments into the different programs. They'll be able to reduce the need for parking as well as save money overall, not build more parking, just invest more in how people travel and providing them with more diverse commute options, and also determining where to target development and discouraging driving and generating less greenhouse gas emissions for an overall improved quality of life. now I'll turn it over to Lauren or Ben.
Yeah, one quick question, and then let's get to the Seattle example. One question coming in. So you mentioned 60% threshold as a requirement for some municipal ordinances, what they're requiring from employers. What are the types of response rates you see in general for just TDM surveys? And this is a question for Carmen, but I'd be curious what Ben sees as well.
I actually haven't had access to that. I think that's also another issue, is that that's pretty held within like the city or regional agency that is putting out that survey. So it's not really shared. I don't know, Ben, if you have had other experiences.
Yeah, this is painful a little bit for me. We have for both our state and city programs, we have a somewhat arbitrary 50% response requirement, but that's totally independent of the size. So it could be a building with 1,000 people surveyed or a building with 100, and we still have a 50% rule, which statistically is not, I don't think, super valid. But yeah, and we do with some sites it's easy. With some sites it's really hard to get to that. So this whole kind of the surveying, the mode split surveying is a real pain point for us that I'll talk about a little bit in a few minutes.
Yeah, that's absolutely jumping out. Just the goal is to make mobility smoother, easier, get people to make the right choices, or better, have better choices to make in the first place. But we are, as a field, creating a lot of, relying on tools that have a lot of friction. So that's a lot of the user interface with the TDM world from average folks is like a lot of surveys, and I'm sure we all have feelings about that. It's also interesting, Carmen, with your kind of scan of the field, that the folks who are collecting the most data right now, it is really biased toward, white collar workers. There's some pretty big gaps about who we're who we're servicing, who we're measuring. So that was super interesting to see jump out. And then I think given the regulatory history of our field, which is great, like policy is what gets the job done, but it also may put us in a position where we're using, the TDM field might be using data out of fear and reactivity a lot, rather than like an informed thought process, prioritizing user experience and being okay with some ambiguity on tracking the specific measures. So super interesting to see your scan of the field. And I'm really excited next to pivot to Ben. So for those of you who are kind of new to the TDM realm, Seattle and Washington State are really at the top of the class here. Really long-standing programs, and we don't have a lot of long-standing comps. We're often short on built examples in the TDM world. So we're often, like across our national practices, looking to what's going on in Seattle, what results have they seen. So he'll dive into it, but they have the benefit of a state TDM law and then a city role in monitoring and implementing. He'll explain all of that. But together, it's quite a robust TDM ecosystem. And having it been in place for so long, he's got kind of been able, they've been able to kind of wrestle with the details in a deep way. And then, of course, I know he'll cover this, but they're thinking a lot about how to do better, how they want to sort of expand the boundaries of TDM beyond the commute. So excited to hear what Ben has to say.
Great, thanks, Lauren. Yeah, I think you summed it up pretty well. We've been around for a while. I've been with STAT for only a couple of years now, but the programs that we've got going have been active for a while, are seen pretty well nationally, and we're kind of spinning our wheels a little bit, so to speak, with what is all this data for, and why are we doing this? And so I'll get into some of those thoughts, specifically around climate action and what we can use TDM data for. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to quickly cover what we're doing, just summarizing a little more about what Lauren just described. And then I'm going to spend the bulk of my time talking about this project that we're working on called the Climate and Congestion Calculator. And I'm going to get pretty deep into the weeds since this was a data presentation, and I'll try to pull out, where the TDM elements in there come from. And then items 3 and 4, I'll pull back and summarize kind of what we think mode shift can do for climate. The short answer is it can do a lot. And then what data uses and needs we have at the city, and maybe tease out some of the discussion topics. So we have an employer-based program that's at the state level. That's the CTR, Commute Trip Reduction Act. And we also have a building-based TDM program, which is the TMP, which is the Transportation Management Program. So it's interesting that some buildings with large employers are also in the city's TMP program. So you have a building which may have CTR and TMP requirements at the same time. So we try to streamline surveying as much as we can, streamline communication, but as you can imagine, it creates a lot of confusion for property owners and big employers. And we do our best, but there's just a lot of requirements that we do have. So we typically survey travel mode every other year, an odd year. So we'll be doing a survey this fall. And then in the off years, speaking a little to what Carmen was talking about, we do ask for program level data from either the property manager or the employee transportation coordinator. So we get really great data, but it's pretty infrequent. And that's definitely a theme of this presentation. Good data, but not so frequently updated. Obviously, COVID has changed things with TDM. My job kind of pivoted pretty quickly last March to sort of like, okay, what do we do? There's no traffic anymore. People aren't going to these buildings as much. We're still enforcing our TMP and CTR requirements. That said, we've been spending the last year, in a way, it's been one of the most interesting years in TDM, I would imagine, for a lot of folks, just because of the change in travel habits. We are going to be surveying this fall. We kind of waffled on that, if we wanted to do that or not. We figured that no matter what sort of the state of the world was, we'd want, some data just to see what building occupancies looked like and what employers were doing. Gradually by the day, I get more optimistic that maybe by fall, we'll be back to some level of normalcy, but we'll see. And we're really thinking about limiting that backslide to SOV. The city of Seattle has done a really good job of decreasing single occupancy vehicle mode splits over the last decade or so as we've grown. We're pretty worried, to be frank, about people shifting back. I've seen numbers in Seattle and the region where traffic volumes are basically now at pre-COVID levels. They're kind of back to normal, but transit ridership is still down like 60, 70, 80%. So that is something we're pretty concerned about. We're also starting to think about different travel profiles, less of the sort of typical 9-to-5 commute 5 days a week. Remote work is obviously a huge thing now, and we expect it'll continue. And then finally, we're looking to do better with our programs, and that data and data standards are totally part of that. So I'm really happy to be participating today in this panel. So I'm going to look at the little bit inside this calculator we're working on. This image is actually a rendering. It's from New York City. A couple of advocacy groups have come out with an idea for 25% of all streets to be something like this. Maybe not this well built out, but something like this by 2025. It's the 25 by 2025 plan. So just thinking about how, imagine 1 out of every 4 blocks just becoming not just car free, but really inviting public spaces, and what that could do for mode split and mode share. Why does this matter? Well, in the Northwest this summer, we had some smoke issues, not uncommon at this point. I know folks further south, down in Oregon and California, have been feeling this even worse than we have up in Washington, and even nationwide and worldwide. This was the Space Needle in September, an undoctored photo. So there's urgency around this internally. I think this summer and fall definitely pushed it further for the city and for folks working on this type of stuff. Seattle's emissions profile is similar, I think, to a lot of cities, but we really do have to think about transportation because it is such a big portion of emissions and carbon emissions. In other cities which have maybe older buildings or dirtier electric grids, maybe transportation isn't as much of a problem, but in Seattle it really is. 60% of our emissions, and of that, you'll see at the top in red here, personal vehicles alone are 51% of all emissions. So that's not just transportation, but all emissions half of them are caused by people driving alone. So we need to shift people either to electric vehicles or, in the case of mode shift, to transit, walking, biking, scooting, hovering, remote working, all the other zero emission modes that are out there. So we have a goal that we set back in 2008 to reduce GHGs by 82% by 2030. So it's kind of like an 80 by 30 goal, give or take. So that was in 2008. So that was 12 years ago. And I don't know if anyone wants to guess. I'm not going to use the Zoom feature or the survey, but we've only reduced emissions by 3% through 2018. So basically, we're halfway there to our time horizon, and we've done 1/30th or 1/40th, whatever the percentage is. We've done very little on transportation emissions, even though we've done great on shifting people into transit, and part of that is population growth. Here's just another kind of example of what we've done so far. Even if, say, we made a little bit more progress in the last 2 years, say down to maybe 77%, we still need 8 to 9% every year between now and 2030, when we've only reduced emissions by, say, about 5% over the last 13 years. So that is a serious challenge, and we've been stressing this internally and are going to start stressing it a little bit more so externally, I think, in the coming years. So SDOT's efforts to try to tackle this problem are basically being broken into 3 buckets. I'll talk about mode shift today, but I do want to point out that shifting to electrification is super important because we do recognize that based on our land use and transportation systems, people will continue to, unfortunately, be pretty auto-dependent for certain types of trips. And I do want to point out, it probably didn't make too many waves, but our mayor presented yesterday at the South by Southwest conference and announced our transportation electrification blueprint. I think that's going to be put out in a press release later today. So that's going to have some really aggressive and I should say aspirational kind of moves towards electrification. And then finally, what we can do beyond just encouraging mode shift is at SDOT, we have to recognize that we manage the right of way and we can price the right of way, all sorts of things in terms of the things we can do behind the scenes to push and pull. So in terms of what SDOT can do, this calculator came about because not all the efforts that we do are created equal. So from left to right, you see kind of stuff that's pretty low intensity, the leading pedestrian interval to get people across the street before cars are given the green light, to the middle, which is bus lanes, to the one on the right, which is a bit hairier, which is a congestion pricing framework, which we're working on. And I know Nelson Nygaard's team helped us kind of develop phase 1 of that study. We kind of want to know what the different climate benefit of these things are, because they're all kind of climate beneficial, but if we don't have kind of good data and good information on sort of the relative impacts of these things, it's hard to evaluate what we should be doing or what we should be pushing harder on. So enter this calculator. So just some items on what it does is that it's a model that shows how our work programs impact both VMT, which is vehicle miles traveled, and resultant transportation emissions. The model allows us to toggle different combos of strategies at different intensities, so based on different types of strategies we can do and how much or how little of them we do, and we can kind of see what GHG reduction may result. The caveat is it is just a model. It's a thought exercise. It helps us understand sort of the scope of the problem. It definitely doesn't have all the answers, but it is, I think it's better than nothing. So the baseline inputs for the model, so I'll start getting into some of the data issues and problems here. So we use the MPO, which is the PSRC, the Puget Sound Regional Council's 2019 Household Travel Survey, to sort of set this up. This is all pre-COVID, so that's one thing to just keep in mind. This is all pre-COVID information. We made that decision because we did figure that eventually COVID would pass and this model is going to have to carry us through the next decade or longer. B, and more appropriate to this conversation, it was kind of the best data we had available in terms of like overall travel behavior within Seattle and the region. But again, it's just a survey. It's a somewhat rich data set. However, it by no means does it capture the universe of travel that's actually happening. So if you look at the table on the right, you'll see that we broke it up into passenger vehicle miles traveled on an average weekday and freight. Freight was a little bit tougher. We had to develop a totally separate estimate because the travel survey didn't really have that. That's a whole other issue I can get into. And then what we also had to do was think about trips that begin or end outside the city, but that come through the city. So based on some global protocols for GHG accounting, we basically take whatever the VMT is and cut it in half to attribute miles that are happening in the city. That said, this whole model is a city model, but the problem of GHG and climate is a regional problem. It's a global problem, but in terms of addressing it, we should be thinking regionally. So we're looking forward to sharing this work with our partners in due time. So within the model, there are 37 different strategies, and these came up just through conversations internally about things that we're either doing or that we say we're going to be doing in our planning documents, or that we could do, but that we maybe haven't quite conceptualized quite yet. And you'll see that, zoom forward one slide, the TDM element has a good amount of things in it, and we're going to continue to keep adding strategies in here. We figured 37 was enough to start. You'll see here the CTR and TMP programs are at the top. Those are the programs that I talked about at the beginning, and I manage the TMP program for the city. And then you've got other things too, like remote and hybrid work. You've got a lot of bike share and scooter share stuff. I know we've talked about some of that. Nothing about cat mobility, but maybe in a future model. So the model is pretty cool. It's getting a little bit more detailed here. Every strategy you'll see on the right, you have a couple of options. You can turn them on, you can turn them off, and then you can select a pathway. So we set it up so that the standard pathway is basically whatever program goals we have, or kind of maybe based on some existing data where we've gone, like where we continue to go with the same kind of level of effort. And then there's the aggressive side, which is basically looking at doing stuff more aggressively. So we had looked at other cities, both here in North America. I saw someone on the phone from Vancouver. We looked northwards. You all are doing some great stuff climate-wise. We looked internationally a little bit too, the Parises, the Londons of the world. And in some cases, we just doubled the standard targets to determine what aggressive might be. And everything that's highlighted in yellow is toggleable, so we can change these assumptions. So what you're seeing today is just sort of a snapshot of where we're at right now, and it's still being worked out. So each of those 37 strategies I mentioned has a detailed page. So I'm going to walk through the CTR, the commute trip reduction law, as an example. This is our employer-based TDM program. So you'll see on the left, in the red box there, we have targets for drive alone rate, DAR. So that's kind of the same thing as an SOV rate. So that's information we get from these mode split surveys, and we only get that information every 2 years. And as I said, some sites are really, really compliant. Others, it's more of a struggle to get the information. But here, we use sort of overarching city plan goals for the drive alone rate at these sites, both for a mid-year horizon, which is 2024, and then our long-term time horizon for the calculator, which is 2030. And then on the aggressive side, you'll see the 2030 number of 26.5% we assumed would happen earlier in 2024, and then we assumed some lower value in 2030 of 20%. What happens next, if you look to the right, just follow along the red boxes. I know there's a lot of numbers here. We take that drive alone rate percentage and we convert it into the amount of car trips that would not be taken because of the CTR program. So basically, by lowering our drive alone rate, we're reducing car trips. We convert that into a VMT saved estimate, which is just based on average commute length. Again, citywide, all CTR companies, obviously not super site specific, but we could theoretically do this for every site that we have data for. And then we convert VMT to emissions saved. And from there, if you just kind of look straight down to the lower right, the calculator does its thing. And you see by 2030, even in the most aggressive scenario, we may reduce GHG emissions by 3.56% because of the CTR program. That doesn't sound like a lot, but actually, compared to a lot of other strategies, it's a pretty significant amount to get us to build up towards that 80% reduction. So I'm going to just go through some summary slides with this information about, again, where the calculator is right now. So just take a look. Keep in mind the yellow bars, which is emissions. The blue bars are VMT. So the blue bars you can kind of think of as sort of proxies for congestion, but the yellow bars are really what I want to focus on. And the bar on the very right is 2030. So we want to see that yellow bar get down to 20%, give or take. That would be an 80% reduction. So you'll see here, this is business as usual. So this is basically whatever we're doing now, we continue to do, but we do nothing else. Like if we just froze and said, okay, that's enough for climate action, that's enough for TDM efforts, like we're just going to stop, clearly we would fall way, way, way short of our emissions reduction targets. That's not really super surprising given the progress we've made so far. So this is the standard scenario. So this is turning all the strategies on, which I will say is still, you know, both politically and from a budget standpoint, not an easy task to do. But if we did do that, we might see emissions drop by about 30% by 2030, which is way, way, way short of the goal. And this is if we actually do everything that we say we're going to do, or that, you know, sort of seems like could be done. Congestion pricing is a good example. We're currently working on figuring out, you know, if and how to roll that out as kind of an equitable pricing measure to price certain types of vehicle trips. But there's no guarantee that that happens. But we still have it in the standard pathway because we've committed to at least looking into it and trying to roll it out. So this is not an easy hill to climb. On the aggressive side, if we put everything to aggressive, then we actually come a lot closer to our GHG goals. And I would think if we could make it to 2030 and cut our carbon by 70%, even if it was short of our 80% reduction, I would think we would be pretty happy. Then again, the aggressive portfolio of projects here is a whole lot. It's a lot more TDM, it's a lot more pricing schemes, it's a lot more bike investment, it's a lot more transit service, it's a lot of everything. It's really expensive. We're in a tough spot right now. So this is definitely not an easy hill to climb. So I think the upshot is this is really hard stuff, but we want to focus on what we can do. So this is that last scenario, and it looks at what the different strategies do in terms of their how much GHG reduction can be attributed to them. And you'll see the blue color on the upper right is TDM and mobility options, which shows a pretty significant amount. Obviously, electrification is critical, but electrification will not, you know, reduce congestion. It will not get us some safety co-benefits that we get from more walking and biking space. It results still in a lot of asphalt production and tire runoff and all sorts of bad environmental things. So we don't think electrification should be a silver bullet. That's where TDM comes into play. So I just want to look at now, in the last couple of minutes, some of the TDM climate specific impacts and the data needs to sort of bring it back full circle to the topic today. So this slide shows that both TDM and shared mobility, so kind of combining them into my team's portfolio, which is Mobility Solutions, could reduce our GHG, in this case, by up to 18%, which is a pretty good amount, given we need to reduce 80, so you'll see all those colorful boxes there on the right side of the square. That's what we could get from more shared mobility and more TDM, according to the calculator. You add to that remote work. Remote work we included as a strategy. We didn't include in the previous calculations just because remote work is a trip that is not taken at all, a work trip that's not taken at all as remote work. Is that still a trip? That's a mode split accounting, maybe data standards question that we're wrestling with, both at the city and state level right now. So we put some assumptions into the calculator about 70% of Seattle workers remote or hybrid working, which I think is really high. This includes even jobs that can't be done remotely. So this is a lot, and Seattle's leading the way on, we're among the most remote type of places in the country right now, I think, due to our large number of tech firms and things like that. So we could get a lot of reduction from remote work, a lot of GHG reduction, but it's definitely not going to be the total solution. It still shows only a 6 to 9% overall GHG reduction, again, because a lot of trips are not work trips. They're other types of trips. You combine these two things, though, and here's sort of the upshot of this presentation, get to a nice clean 33%, like 1/3 of our potential climate progress, according to this calculator, could come from the stuff that we're all talking about today. And that's really, I think, really a good thing to think about, and a positive spin on sort of this negative story of how much of a challenge we have, that this work really matters a lot from the climate perspective. And that's one thing I think Lauren was saying before, just sort of the TDM evolution. Like, if we could only just kind of get better data and not have to worry about the data collection and surveying and chasing down developers so often, it'd be great to really focus on policy evolution and how we can all partner together on this really, global catastrophic challenge we have ahead of us with climate change. So some weaknesses and some data needs. So I mentioned non-commute trips. So we did an analysis earlier this year of all trips in Seattle, again, with a different PSRC data set. And 80% of Seattle's trips are non-commute. And yet our TDM program historically has been almost entirely commute focused. So this is something we really want to change up, and it has equity implications too. A lot of, a lot of regular commute trips that are sort of measured and impacted by our traditional programs are white collar workers, and we often have ignored and underserved communities of color and underserved communities because of just the way our TDM programs have been set up. Secondly, the mode choice data is a shortcoming of the climate calculator and a shortcoming just of my general day-to-day work on the TMP program. As I said, we get that data every 2 years. It's great data when it comes in, but we don't have enough time. If we waited every 2 years now to think about how we're doing, that's only 4 more, maybe 5 more survey cycles before we get to that 2030 time horizon. Like, we cannot be measuring our effectiveness only 5 times between now and 2030 when we need to make that big progress. So I like to talk about a little more about how we get real-time data. I think there are pros and cons of the use of big data or open data or whatever kind of standards and things that have been talked about already. And I look forward to discussing a little bit further about how we can kind of iterate and improve on the types of data we take in for TDM. So thank you, appreciate it.
Thanks, Ben. A couple of quick questions popping up. With the emissions number, I think it was about a third of the way through, you mentioned that it's been really hard to get that emissions number to budge. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on just what's contributing to making that figure so stubborn, despite, I mean, just an incredible ecosystem of programs.
Yeah, definitely population growth, like, is just the obvious answer. So I think per capita, so if we want to talk per capita and be really like positive, I think we've reduced emissions in the last decade by like 20%, which is great. But because unfortunately, pros and cons about Seattle's growth and cities growing too quickly and affordability, all that sort of stuff that we don't need to get into directly. Because of that, unfortunately, like as I've been saying, the climate does not care at all about our population growth. In fact, it can be a negative. So that's why we haven't budged too much. So I think previously, I'm not going to attribute this to anyone, but folks have been touting us as doing really well, and we have been doing well. But we need to kind of, I think, start communicating to the public a little more about, even though we're doing well, we still need to do more. And it's tough to hear, but we need to be saying it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate that humility. There's a question in the chat too. Hayes is interested in hearing more about your view on the pro and con of big data for mode split. So I'm assuming that would be some kind of IoT cell phone or vehicle data to roll up mode split to a district or citywide level. I'm guessing that's what they're referencing.
Yeah, a little bit. I'm thinking like, citywide, like the work I just presented today, it's okay if it's not site specific. In fact, it's totally fine. So I see mostly pros there. The cons probably, again, being just privacy issues and people worrying about certain things related to that, which is not my area of expertise, but I know everyone else on the call could probably help me learn a little bit about it. At the site specific level though, like for the programs that we do manage, the CTR and TMP programs, which, we still need to collect data for, like how can we, if we have a building with like 5 different employers, and we need to figure out how each employer is doing with regards to their goals, but we're using big data. Like, how do we attribute, oh, this person who traveled in by bus works for company X, or no, they work for company Y. And we haven't gotten past that, like at least intellectual problem yet. And maybe there are ways to do it, I don't know. But I really am trying to push us to, at some point, stop surveying people. At least now we're doing it online and not by paper anymore, which is great. But I think Carmen can agree that surveying is just, it's really hard.
Yeah, it's maybe not the most effective. So there's one more question showing up in Slido, and I think this is more of a Heidi question. So I'm going to ask you this, and then we're going to pivot to kind of a little more interactive session here that Carmen will pull up. We're going to stay in one group, but I want to just ask a few pointed questions of us and the audience around where to go from here, like how to connect these dots. So we'll get to that in a second. But Heidi, one question that popped up for you in Slido is around, okay, how is granular data from GBFS, MDS, etc., useful if the overwhelming majority of travel, private cars, is measured with unreliable tools like surveys? Is that question landing? I'm not sure I fully understand it, to be honest with you, but maybe you do.
I think I understand it, and I'll let whoever asks it correct me if I'm wrong in my understanding of it. And I might take a mobility data hat off for a moment and put a like Heidi who lives in the universe and rides a bike hat on. One of a big topic of conversation around, I think this came up in particular on MDS, because MDS is used for regulatory and compliance reasons, but the data, like similar kinds of data exist with GBFS and in its kind of real-time nature, is this question of why are we requiring so much data and why are we using so much of a regulatory hand on shared mobility vehicles when shared mobility vehicles are probably getting us closer to a lot of the goals that we want as a city than privately driven automobiles. So if I am taking a bike share or scooter share, the scooter share bike share company is subject to the fines and fees and regulations if I do something wrong with it as a passenger, and then my data as a passenger is being tracked, the route I'm taking is being tracked, these kinds of things, right? But if I am driving my own private car, none of that exists, right? This is also true if I'm riding my own private bicycle, but I think that's part of the concern, right? And so what I hear in that question a little bit is we're talking about collecting a lot of data about the modes that we do most want people to use, and we think that they might be the most useful in our TDM evaluation and in our climate change goals and in all these things. But this other thing is what we're trying to reduce. We have nothing about that, and so that absolutely limits the usefulness of the data across the board. I will say that from my perspective, when we're showing information in GBFS, we're just showing the options that are available. And I think on that granular side, what that means is that as a TDM practitioner, a lot of times the most useful part of that might just be saying, okay, we're looking at this place, like, is this employer making these options available? Are they never available, but because they're constantly being used? I mean, really starting to get a sense of like what the uptake is. It is not going to tell you, well, but sure, the scooters are always in use, but also the parking lot is full of cars. That is not information that these are going to provide. And I think that it's a well acknowledged gap. And I do think that the folks who, when I have been in rooms where the folks who are talking about kind of MDS and development of MDS, the hope is that it gets there, right? I mean, a lot of the cars they have computers. I think there's a very, very long-term vision of AVs being kind of serving a lot of those single occupancy trips, and then how the AVs would generate similar kinds of data. But yeah, right now it does feel like there's a pretty big gap.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, big challenges here. We're going to pivot now in a second to a sort of a brainstorm session with the whole group. So if folks in the audience feel like putting themselves on video, please do. Cats welcome in the background, children in the background also encouraged. And I think it's been a really interesting couple of years as a TDM practitioner. We've had a fairly narrow view. We've been wanting to make the field more effective, and the urgency of some of the challenges we're all facing really can't be overstated. I think that really came through in Ben's section. We are good at delivering programs and figuring out generally kind of what works. And that framework is really critical, but you know, the bias toward action and the bias toward big tent solutions and the bias toward kind of taking what we're good at as a field and translating it to much, much bigger goals, I think is on all of our minds. It's not that, I'm kind of coming across as critiquing the TDM field a little bit, but it's a bit of the opposite. It's a bit of we need to take ourselves out of the corner, I would say, and think bigger, because some of the mobility challenges around just access and knowing that increasing mobility is one of the most important things we can do for an equitable society, and then the climate crisis are all calling for us to think in a similar way, which is around a program or a portfolio of actions and with aggressive targets. But we haven't quite been thinking that big, to be honest with you. You know, and so we're in this interesting transition as a TDM field, and then so much of what we do, we're trying to figure out, you know, what's working. We haven't always been the most well-resourced field either, I would say, despite some really ambitious goals that bring all of our different kind of modal conversations together. So it's just an interesting turning point we're sitting at. And when we think about the role of data and getting there, we know it's been our Achilles heel in a lot of ways, the friction in seeing what works, getting better data, tweaking what we're doing. And so I see that really playing into what came through in Ben's section around, you know, getting that bias toward action, getting faster results and making tweaks more quickly, which is not something that, you know, we as sort of folks related to kind of government programs are typically great at, but we want to be. We want to be doing, you know, better TDM interventions, more data informed, more quickly, and we quite frankly have to. So that data friction component and the sort of better information component really is a key ingredient to, I think, our ambitions as a field to step up to the challenges at our doorstep. So that's the type of thing we want to get into the mechanics of in Q&A. We're all just going to stay here in the main group. I'm really interested in some of the crosstalk between disciplines. I'm interested to hear what Heidi and some of the other more data specialist folks in the audience think, kind of hearing what Carmen and Ben and I are struggling with in our work and where we're hitting some pain points. I'm curious what ideas came to your mind in those moments. So I would encourage everybody to kind of stand up and wiggle a little bit. We've been here for a while. So definitely, you know, relax, stand up, stretch. But we are just going to keep going to make sure that we kind of build on what we just went through individually. So this next slide, yeah, Carmen, can you just kind of reveal the research or the discussion questions really quickly, and we'll get these on the table. And then we're just going to leave these up, and I want to encourage other folks to share what's coming to mind for them in the chat or unmute yourself. So we want to discuss, you know, how we can extend existing standards to meet these TDM goals that we've covered, our pain points, what are the gaps, what's not being bridged. This might be a Heidi and audience question around what would be needed from the data industry to better support those types of applications. A question for TDM folks in the audience and on the panel. Where are we accessing this data now, and how are we using it, and where, you know, what do we need to do there? What barriers are there? This is especially, I think, as cities are taking more ownership over TDM outcomes. I would say transit agencies are also taking more ownership over TDM outcomes. what are some barriers to them having and using better mobility data? And then, this is all, we don't only want to think kind of narrowly in our sandbox. We want to think about bigger picture policy and governance solutions. I think everybody here wants to step up to the challenges of the day with the skill sets and tools they have, be that TDM strategies or data solutions that help unlock the effectiveness of the TDM portfolios and policies that we have to bring to these challenges. So thinking a little bit bigger, is there anything on the policy and governance front that's getting in the way of better use of data, tracking and implementing effective TDM programs? So with that, I'm just going to move so I can see everybody here. Anybody from the audience have any reactions to today's discussion that they want to start with? And if not, I'm also curious how the panelists are seeing kind of some of the cross-referencing of the different expertise that we've gone through today.
It looks like we have a shy group this morning. I think one of the things that I am interested in hearing more from the TDM folks in particular about is this idea of how the data gets produced and why someone should produce it, because I do think that one of the challenges when I was talking about the data standards that exist, one of the things that we do with the organization where I work is it's a consensus-based governance process with the data producers and the data consumers in the same room. And one of the challenges of, you can imagine all of the challenges of that, right? Consensus-based, global specification. It's a lot, and people have a lot of, they come to the table with a lot of aspirations and a lot of hopes and needs and a lot of fears about what they're going to be asked to do, right? But because everyone who comes to the table generally also recognizes the value of standardization, they're willing to have the conversation, right? And because we require them to say out in public they're the ones who killed a particular proposal, it does kind of mean everybody is, they're a little more willing to play a little more nicely. I'm interested in how that resonates with what we've been talking about in terms of TDM standards, in terms of the regulatory nature of the programs, and then the data that funding programs are asking or cities are asking, how you're working with the private sector who's responding to this. Like, does that kind of governance or that kind of process feel possible? Does it feel just like way too far out there?
Heidi, I would say too, this is Becky Steckler. I'm the program director at Urbanism Next, and I'm really curious to see kind of like what the response is from the private sector that might be requested to collect this information and what they see as some of the biggest barriers or their kind of biggest concerns as well. So I know we've got folks from the city of Vancouver, and Mark, I'll put you on the spot. I know Mark is from previously with the city of Detroit and has done a lot of that public work too.
Mark's taking the dog out, I think.
That could be.
I'll add a little of my opinion on some of that. So there is a new wave of TDM policies being written for new developments, and that some of that covers employers. So you think, programs like, SDOTs and the Washington State's overall regulations have kind of an ecosystem that they're evolving, but there's a lot of things being written from scratch right now and a lot of interest in doing it right. So I think there is an opening on the private land side of things for how to contribute and shape contributions toward TDM goals. I don't have as much of a purview into mobility providers and what their reaction would be. But we're asking all kinds of new things in our field right now of developers and employers. And I think people just want it to make sense and to spend their friction on things that are meaningful. So that negative association of TDM with just a bunch of surveys, I think we're all eager to ditch that and focus on the actions. So it's funny, like I'm so hungry for better TDM data, but I'm also tired of being too hamstrung by data as well. It's like we can't really wait for it. We can't wait for another decade of research. We do need to have that bias toward action, but we want to, getting that kind of context-specific outcome and data is super important too, to tweak it later. So it's an interesting balancing act in my head.
Yeah, I'll add to that a little bit. I think sometimes with the city, we sort of let the perfect be the enemy of the good on the data side. Like, I think generally speaking, we know what works with TDM. We know we should be limiting parking supply. We know parking supply that does exist should be actively managed. We know that employers and buildings that provide transit passes to their users see higher rates of transit use. Like, it's not, as someone said earlier, it's not rocket science, this stuff. It's like just kind of, it's mostly pretty known at this point. So like how much the data, the real-time data really matters. It's more about just, I think, for our own sake in monitoring. And then at least where I get stuck is that, well, we have these regulatory mechanisms that we have in place. We sort of have to collect the data. So I'm almost forced in my job to spend a lot more time thinking about a site-specific, survey response rate than I wish I had to be. And I mean, maybe that's another question for other cities out there. Like, how do we kind of, with Seattle, we've been doing this for so long. We're so deep into the weeds of these programs, and they exist, and everyone knows about them, and we have to keep them going because they're great. But then we sort of get stuck with the data side. So I think it's a chicken and egg problem, and I struggle with it. And it's nice to pull back and think about this like holistically.
Yeah, Heidi's asking a question in the chat. Are we being put in the position of substituting data for political will? I love that question. I think that you could absolutely critique, not the full TDM world, of course, I'm generalizing, but you could absolutely say that there's been too much emphasis on marketing plans and data and not enough on the action. I mean, to Ben's point, we need to have infrastructure, we need to pay people to use it, and we need to get rid of all the damn parking. Like, and price it. I mean, it's not that hard. Like, we don't want to, I mean, so I'm a consultant, right? We get, I hate seeing budgets that are putting a third of the effort on the metric side, and it's not clear what they want to accomplish. That drives me insane. And I think there's been some interesting critiques of the TDM world during this pandemic year, where just more kind of out of the box thinking of sort of being, cross-reference in our field. Metrics monitoring, super important, but if the hook doesn't match it, then I'm not sure that we're doing our job as a profession. So I've heard, you could call it like the Andrew Yang critique of the TDM world. Like, are we just giving people tools? Like, what if we spent that metrics budget on giving out free bikes, giving out free transit passes, things like that. So there's been some interesting conversations on that front. And I guess, Heidi, I'm kind of curious, like, when you were overhearing maybe Ben in particular, but also Carmen talk about what they need data to do. Did any kind of data standard applications or next steps come to your mind?
Well, I mean, I think there is data that is being generated through existing standards, which is helpful. I don't know it will answer all of the questions that you have, right? I mean, but I think that the whole point of it depends on what you're trying to understand. If you're trying to understand what's available and how it's being used, then that data is out there. If you're trying to understand it attached to a specific individual, then that's not something that you're going to be able to do with the publicly published data. And it's not something that you're going to be able to do, you're going to really be able to get access to with the private data that's being exchanged through MDS either. Back to the question of the question that I posed. I mean, I pose it in part as just a person, right, who lives in a city that I love, and I know we have such a backlog of bicycle infrastructure that the city hasn't been able to deliver on yet, right? And so when I hear well, we need all of this data to know where we should do it, I think that, and to this concern about TDM just being seen as surveying, there is a point where I think it puts TDM professionals and planners in a position of saying we know, we've planned it, it's already there. But with every new round of funding that comes in, with every new administration that comes in, everybody needs to be kind of reconvinced, and they have to, it just puts us in a kind of cruddy position. So I do think that there are standards that are out there, but I think that it behooves all of us to kind of come together on the same page a little bit and start advocating for the same things, right? So I think if you have standards bodies saying, listen, I mean, this is part of what we're trying to do right now. Hey, city regulators, when you put together a permit, please ask for publicly published GBFS data. And if you want other data that's not in MDS or in GBFS, but it's a little too sensitive, here's how to ask for it. And here's how to talk to us about getting it added to the standard, right? And then having that conversation side by side with you all so that you can say, yeah, here's how we're going to use that data. Yes, please include this in the permits, because this is what we want to do with that data as well. And that means we don't have to do these other things because we're going to use that as a proxy, right? And I think us also having your back in some ways and being able to say, this particular really granular data is not actually, it has these privacy concerns. It's not that useful in these ways. This kind of aggregated, I mean, there's a lot of folks who all over the industry are thinking about this kind of aggregated information helps answer these questions in the way that you need, the granularity that you need to make the kinds of decisions that you're trying to make. So I think more than we can cobble together lots of useful things from the individual data standards for sure. I think we should be talking about additions or revisions to those data standards that would be really helpful to the evaluation and research community. And then I think on top of that, we all should just be figuring out kind of a shared chorus of what we get behind in terms of advocating for the requirements around data, both what we require from operators and then for what we're requiring from employers and developers and things like that.
Heidi, this is, I think, so data standards. So is it possible to have a common language here when we're dealing with municipalities, regions, and states that all have a different policy foundation for what we're trying to achieve? So it's the same universe of TDM strategies, but here in Austin, it's tied to the traffic impact process. And so our native language is traffic reductions. And we also care deeply about mode split. We have a big mode split goal. In other municipalities, it could be tied to VMT as a metric. Ben's trying to innovate and add climate and emissions metrics into their fold. And in SoCal, where Carmen's done some of her work, it's all about air quality and emissions. That's the historic foundation for a lot of the local TDM programs built on top of it. And I'm sure there's, just you could go on and on. So can we even, is there even room to have a standard language here? Or are we hopelessly fragmented? And I don't know the answer, but I'm sure that you've had the same challenge. Like I'm thinking about curb LR, and I mean, I'm very familiar with how different cities have different units of how blocks and curbs and spaces talk to each other as well. So maybe there's more potential there than I can picture as a sort of a non-data geek.
So I think I think this is where folks have to, there's a ton of upfront facilitation and compromise required with this, right? So GBFS, the General Bike Share Fee Specification, that is used in coming up on 500 public data sets across 45 different countries, right? Does it produce every single thing that is like specific to that country, that operating system? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And but we start with what we call kind of minimum viable proposals. What is the first thing that we need, right? And how do we present this way? So right now, for example, in GBFS, we represent how far a vehicle can go on a full tank, whether it's a full charge or a full tank of gasoline for a combustion vehicle, and then the I think we like and then the range that it can go right now, right? Like given what it's got, how far can it go right now? There's all kinds of requests. We want battery percentage. We want it presented this way. We want it presented that way. When we started talking about fees, and people wanted it by kilometers, and they wanted it by miles, and they wanted it by seconds, and they wanted it by minutes, generally what we say is, let's figure out the one thing. Everyone has to convert it after that. Sorry, I don't know how to stop it happening. Everyone has to convert it from there, right? So I think with the question about everyone having different metrics, being able to say, okay, well, can we agree on one or two ways that a provider would have to tell us the CO2 emissions of the vehicle or of the trip? And then we build the tools on top of it that separate it out into our different needs, right? So there are going to be, when GBFS starts to represent bikes that have, or scooters that are seated and standing, maybe there are some people who really never care, right? And maybe they end up using a trip planner that just gives them every single thing that's available within a 2-block radius. But maybe there's somebody who really wants a seated scooter with cargo space, and there's a trip planner that's really developed, and it's a lot heavier touch, and it eats a lot more data to get to all those things. So I think the agreement of like the easiest amount of data that can be converted into the like software that you need, and you can say, okay, well, we just got that piece. That piece kind of helps these 3 different things that we want. It's not exactly what we wanted, but how do we convert it? And I think that question that I have about like what's nice to have versus like we can't possibly conceive of this being useful for evaluation. What are the tools and structures and frameworks you need built up around it? Because you don't have to do that alone. But I don't think this is out of the realm of being able to create a shared baseline. And I think did that, then particularly the mobility operators, they're used to that. I'm sure the developers are in other universes, right? And might be happy to see a standard that they could just adhere to instead of recreating something new every time. But it has to have teeth behind it. And so if your data requirements aren't being enforced, then there's not really a reason for them to put the time into helping create a new standard, for example.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think that there's definitely something like another way of putting this would be, we know that our field can get hung up on metrics, and we know that that can slow down action. Like I participate in a lot of development TDM policy conversations and kind of see the public and private sector wrestle with how to make sure that everyone's doing their part. I guess a question for us would be, is there a way to substitute some of that fear for quicker, standardized way of measuring success to speed up parts of the process and get to faster action. So, you know, that big process of proving that you're going to reduce trips, reduce VMT, reduce emissions, is there a standard, is there a role in that for some type of common language or common standard to skip? I mean, and honestly, it could be in the developer world, it could be like a year or two of of pain and review and back and forth, and freeing up resources on the city side as well to get to faster action. Do you all see, I mean, do you think that's too optimistic of a goal? Do you think that a common data language could help with that?
Yeah, I think it could. And we've been working with the state of Washington here on a new survey mechanism. I don't think it's getting quite that far in terms of, maybe it is. I don't know. I haven't been super involved with the conversations, but I think to me what I keep coming back to is, you know, we have these very detailed requirements for things like shared mobility providers or transit operators, because we sort of have an in with them. There's only so many of them. But when it comes to a private car trip, like how do we get that data in a very standardized way that doesn't result in us struggling through some of the privacy implications or other implications? So I guess I'm answering my own question, is I think we do need our developer partners and our employer partners on board with whatever it is we set up. And then, I mean, it's almost like, if I choose to live in this development that, you know, is part of this TMP program, part of my lease, when I sign my lease, is I will like authorize to give up my mobility data 2 weeks a year in whatever way it is. Like, I don't know. Like, I think we need to figure out how that all works.
Mm-hmm. Ben, you have some of the best data of all of us outside of kind of the historic bodies around like CAPCOA that Carmen gave us the overview on, but you have some of the most longstanding data access on what's effective. I wanted to ask you earlier, what measures are proving most effective? Just like top 3, what's moving the needle in your body?
Well, at least with what I presented today on that calculator, we sort of rolled everything up, right? So like the CTR program or the TMP program, these big TDM programs, we just looked at the results. We looked at like, what's their drive alone rate performance compared to overall citywide drive alone rates, just overall. And that differential, the delta, is basically what we attributed to the benefit of the program. So I hate to say it, but I don't have that information either. Like, so we have like, you know, let's say a given site responds to a TMP survey and, you know, we see, oh, you know, they're doing really well. They continue to make good progress on their SOV rate. Like maybe we have a decade's worth of data. We also know that this TMP site has been conditioned with some land use approvals in the TMP to say, okay, you must provide transit passes to your users. You must do active parking management, whatever it may be. But it's really hard to connect those dots. And like, I've used that CAPCOA report too, because I don't know where else to look sometimes. I think what I've seen recently, just in reading and seeing research, obviously it's parking supply. I kind of mentioned that earlier. I think it's parking supply and availability of and incentives for transit use. To me, those are the 2 most important things, and they kind of go together. If you don't have a lot of parking or it's priced really high, plus you have another alternative option, which is usually a transit trip, like no offense to walking and biking, but usually for longer trips, transit is going to be way more effective. I feel like those are the two holy grail things. So like when I review new TMPs that come in now, I immediately look at what's their parking ratio and what's the transit situation there and what are they offering to support the transit situation. So.
Yeah, that definitely mirrors what comes through in the older CAPCOA data, even though we have less information about context. I think, you know, as we try to figure out how to slice this, another way we could frame where to focus would be on what are the spots in our practice where data would help push political will, to Heidi's question in the chat. So there's some areas where focus on metrics is weighing down or serving to substitute political will, but there are some areas where it would be immensely helpful. And in my opinion, that would be on like comps in general for projects, built or employers or any TDM project. Honest assessments of what's working. A lot of, outside of, even in places like Seattle and Washington State, where there's longstanding programs, there's still not a ton of built projects to point to. There are more and more, but that's not common. And so I think people need certainty around what's been done and what works. I think a database of comps similar to King County Metro's right size parking tool or the green trips tool in the Bay Area, just like aggregating information on some level to build awareness of built projects and things that work is important. And then on the parking front, we didn't get into this a ton today. Carmen did touch on it, but the parking component of our TDM world is, heavily reliant on really inappropriate data. So if I think about where there can be some low-hanging fruit and some interventions on like more immediate and sort of data sources and data framing, those two really jump out at me. And then on the broader like performance metrics across bigger portfolios and bigger processes and matching toward policy outcomes, that's like a different scale of need. So it's like I can picture some discrete projects and I can picture some industry-wide needs as well. So we're at time. I think a question that all of us are going to walk away with is around what would be next to keep convening conversations like this, potentially with TDM and mobility, natural conveners in our world. We'd love to keep in touch with our mobility data standards colleagues like Heidi, who help understand kind of the art of the possible and how she's thread the needle from past mobility conversations. I think we have a lot to learn from some of the last couple of years of progress on that front. TDM is, I think, a pretty sticky practice area. It's really hard. It's hard to wrestle it to the ground. And so I would just ask anybody in the audience who has a real passion for this or further ideas to be in touch with all of us. I think we're interested in pushing this conversation forward across our projects and then just as an industry. I'm really, again, want to just return to the important role that the TDM industry could have moving forward to help expand mobility equity and further track overall climate and emissions goals. We can't really sit on the sidelines. So as much as we don't have all of the answers around how to better track effectiveness, I think we all need to get bold, get experimental, and stay really, really focused on action outcome. So really grateful for all of my panelists here. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. Thanks for the audience members, and be in touch if you want to stay involved in the next leg of this conversation.
Thank you all. We really appreciate it. And be sure to come back in another 2 hours and a half for our keynote presentations. Thanks.
Everybody.
Thank you.